In this session, we'll explore two questions that have shaped much of my work in learning and development. The first is, why is it that so much corporate learning achieves such high rates of participation, but doesn't always achieve changed behavior in practice? The second is, what can trainers do differently to move corporate training from compliance to transformation? Let's dive in. Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm so happy to be part of D2L's Fusion Conference this year. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Catherine Bastoros, and I currently lead a training team within specialty health at McKesson Canada. Throughout my career, I have had the opportunity to work across education and training in private, public, and NGO sectors, both in Canada and internationally. When I transitioned from education into corporate training, one observation stood out almost immediately. Organizations spend an enormous amount of time and resources in professional development. Employees are regularly assigned training, certifications, compliance modules, and professional development activities, many of which are completed on a recurring basis. That leads me to my first question. How many professional development courses have you completed in your career thus far? Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, and there will be many more to come. Now ask yourself a second question. How many of those learning experiences actually changed your day-to-day professional behavior 6 months later? For most of us, the answer is surprisingly few, and that should concern us. In the United States alone, estimates from the Association for Talent Development suggest that organizations invest well over $100 billion annually in employee learning and development, reflecting the scale of global investment in professional systems. Learning management systems track completion rates. Certifications are awarded, micro-credentials are earned. Yet many organizations continue to struggle with the same challenge. People complete learning. However, workforce data and large-scale industry reports in the 2020s consistently show a persistent gap between learning participation and sustained changes in professional practice. While completion rates and learner satisfaction often appear strong, organizations continue to report difficulty demonstrating consistent translation of learning into performance outcomes and operational impact. I've put a few references to these statistics up on the screen and encourage you to dive deeper. What the research is saying, in other words, is what is easy to measure tends to look successful, while what matters most for performance is harder to capture and less consistently influenced by training alone. And I would argue the reason for that is surprisingly simple. Most professional development is designed around content consumption rather than identity change. We often assume that if people receive information, they will naturally apply it. However, contemporary workforce learning evidence and implementation science consistently indicate that this assumption does not hold in practice. Large-scale industry reports in professional learning continue to show a persistent gap between learning participation and sustained changes in workplace behavior, where completion and satisfaction metrics are far more consistently achieved than observable performance change. What determines whether learning is implemented is not only the quality of the training itself, but the presence of enabling conditions in the work environment, including opportunities to apply learning in context, access to feedback, ongoing coaching, and organizational reinforcement structures that sustain behavior over time. Knowing something and consistently doing something are very different processes. Think about how often we already know what we should do. We know we should exercise, we know we should give better feedback, we know we should communicate more effectively, we know we should use evidence-informed practices. The problem is rarely awareness. The problem is integration. And that is where many professional programs begin to break down. It is also important to recognize that before implementation can even occur, integration is often constrained by how learning is experienced and processed in the first place. In many professional learning environments, individuals are expected to engage with large volumes of content that are not always directly connected to their day-to-day practice. Without deliberate opportunities for application and reflection, much of what is learned is not easily carried forward into practice. When learning is delivered in high volume or decontextualized formats, professionals are then asked to make those connections independently. In reality, many do not have the time, cognitive bandwidth, or structural support to consistently bridge abstract concepts with applied work across multiple learning experiences. As a result, even well-designed content may fail to translate into action, not because it lacks quality, but because it is not sufficiently embedded into the context where it needs to be applied. Such training focuses on knowledge acquisition while largely ignoring behavioral change. Today, I'd like to challenge that approach and offer several practical strategies that organizations can implement immediately to move from compliance to transformation. Let's begin with a common misconception. Many organizations treat training as the intervention. In reality, training is usually just the introduction. The real intervention is everything that happens after the training ends. When learners return to work, they re-enter systems that often reward old habits. The workload is the same, the culture is the same, the expectations are the same, the incentives are even the same. And then we wonder why nothing changes. James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, makes an observation that I think applies perfectly to professional development. He argues that people do not rise to the level of their goals, they fall to the level of their systems. Organizations often focus heavily on learning goals while paying very little attention to implementation systems. As a result, even highly motivated individuals struggle to sustain change. This brings us to the first practical shift. Stop designing for completion and start designing for behavior. Many learning initiatives begin with questions like, how many modules do we need? How many hours should the training be? How will we measure completion? Those are useful operational questions, but they are not the most important questions to ask. Instead, we should start by asking, what should participants actually be doing differently 30 days from now? Notice that this shifts the conversation immediately. For example, rather than saying participants will understand effective feedback strategies, define a behavioral outcome. Like participants will conduct one structured feedback conversation each week using a specific framework. Now we have something observable, something measurable, something that can be reinforced. If you cannot identify a specific behavioral outcome, you may be designing content rather than designing change. But this raises an important question. If information alone produced change, most professional development would be remarkably effective. The fact that it often is not suggests that knowledge is only part of the equation. Behavioral science increasingly points to a deeper factor: how individuals see themselves and the professional identities they are attempting to develop. This brings us to the second shift. James Clear in Atomic Habits argues that lasting behavioral change is often the most successful when it becomes connected to identity rather than simply to goals or outcomes. In other words, sustainable change occurs when people begin to view new behaviors as part of who they are, rather than simply something they are expected to do. This distinction matters because professionals are far more likely to sustain behaviors that align with their sense of self than behaviors that feel externally imposed. Think about the difference between these two messages. The first message says, you need to learn a new skill. The second says, this skill helps you become the kind of professional you want to be. Those messages may sound similar, but psychologically they are very different. One focuses on compliance, the other focuses on identity. Identity drives behavior far more effectively than information alone. When learners begin to see a practice as part of their professional identity, implementation becomes more sustainable. A simple strategy is to build identity reflection directly into learning experiences. At the end of a course or a module, ask participants, how does this skill align with the professional you want to become? What aspect of your current practice could this strengthen? What would successful implementation look like in your context? These questions require very little time, but they help move learning from content consumption towards professional identity formation. The third shift involves feedback. John Hattie's research has consistently highlighted feedback as one of the most powerful influences on learning and improvement. Yet many professional programs provide almost no meaningful feedback after completion. Learners complete a module, they pass a quiz, they receive a certificate, and then the feedback stops. Imagine instead that every learning initiative included a structured follow-up. 30 days later, participants submit a brief implementation reflection. What did they try? What worked? What barriers emerged? What support do they need? Even simple feedback loops can dramatically improve transfer because they create accountability and opportunities for adjustment. The goal is not perfection. The goal is iteration. Professionals improve when they receive information about their performance and have opportunities to refine their practice. The fourth shift is perhaps the most important. Design the follow-up before you design the course. Before creating content, ask, how will implementation be supported? Who will reinforce the learning? When will learners have opportunities to practice? How will progress be monitored? What happens 30, 60, and 90 days after completion? If there are no answers to those questions, there is a strong possibility that the learning experience will become another completed course that produces very little sustained change. Training should not be viewed as the finish line. Training should be viewed as the starting point. So, how can organizations quickly evaluate whether their current professional programs are positioned for success? I'd like to offer a simple 5-question audit. Rate your current initiative from 1 to 5 in each category. The first is relevance. Can learners clearly connect the content to real workplace challenges? The second is identity. Does the learning support the professional they want to become? The third is autonomy. Do learners have meaningful ownership over implementation? The fourth is feedback. Will learners receive information about their progress after the training ends? And fifth, reinforcement. Does the organization actively support ongoing implementation? If any category scores below 3, you've likely identified a barrier to transfer, and that barrier may have a greater impact on outcomes than the quality of the content itself. As we conclude, I'd like to return to the idea that opened this presentation. Most professional development is not as successful as it is meant to be because it is designed around content consumption rather than identity change. People do not transform simply because they have access to information. Transformation occurs when learning becomes embedded in professional identity, reinforced through feedback, supported by organizational systems, and translated into daily practice. The future of professional learning is not simply creating more content. Most organizations already have plenty of content. The future of professional learning is designing environments where behavioral change can actually occur. When we shift our focus from completion to implementation, from information to identity, and from training events to learning ecosystems, professional learning becomes far more than a requirement. It becomes a catalyst for meaning and measurable change. Please see my references listed here. I encourage you to continue to research and dive deeper into how to move from compliance to transformation. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I'd love to keep in touch.